introduce Vijay Seshadri first, and then we'll have Morgan read, and then we'll have Indran read. I'm thrilled to introduce Vijay Seshadri, who was my teacher at Sarah Lawrence. I often wondered how Vijay carved out time for his own amazing poems, given the dedication and careful attention he bestowed on his lucky students. I still don't know how he manages all his different worlds: teacher, poetry editor at Paris Review, writer. But after he won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry in 2014 for his incredibly powerful book, Three Sections, I kind of stopped my worrying and just began to simply celebrate Vijay's gifts and his brilliance. We are in for a treat to hear Vijay read from his fourth book of poems, This Is Then, That Was Now, which came out in 2020. There are many voices in American poetry. Vijay's is one of the big voices. His poems are at once personal and mythic. In an absolutely stunning poem to his dying mother called Your Living Eyes, the angel of death comes to visit her, but is brought down to the scale of our human world in a surprising and quirky way. She sidles in, disguised as a little girl, clutching at her pinafore and chewing the ends of her pigtails. The mind in these pages grapples with the largest ideas, but also has an intimate knowledge of the natural world down to its smallest details, which are described in lyric passages that both thrill the eye and ear. Here's one such passage from a poem called Road Trip. The volcanic beaches fringed with black sand and heaped with tangled beds of kelp by the obsidian tide pools that cradle the ribbed limpet and the rock-bound star. I just love that rock-bound star, the low and the infinite. There are so many treasures to be found in his latest book. There is a heartbreaking elegy for Tom Lux, a much beloved head of our MFA program at Sarah Lawrence and Vijay's dear friend. I'm secretly hoping Vijay will read it here. But I love the point in the poem where Vijay discusses the phantom self created by the poet whose eyes are too bright, who sees more than the poet can bear to see. I feel so grateful that we have stayed in touch over these 20 years, Vijay, and I'm honored to introduce you. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Sally. Sally and I go way back, and it's been one of the delightful kind of results of my teaching career, my relationship to her, and our kind of continued interaction over space and time. And it's great to be here. And, you know, it's great to be back at the Hudson Valley reading series. I think, like, over the years since, well, for the past 20 years or so, I think every time a book has come out, I've read here, or around when a book has come out, I've read here. So it's kind of, it's a migratory experience and a constant return for me. So, you know, thank you all for having me again. And I kind of, I have to leave, and I will come back for the Q&A. So I'm just going to read for 20 minutes. And I think I'll start out with the elegy to Tom Lux. The center of this book is dominated by elegies. And then it sort of has two sides to it that have poems that are kind of a little different from one another. And I'll read one elegy and I'll read one of those poems, and then I'll end with a poem for one of the poems in the first section, and I'll end with a poem from the third section. And a lot of people, of course, in this audience know Tom might have been taught by him or certainly know of him. And he was very, very important to me from the time I was 19. We were never people who hung out together, but he was one of those people who had an absolute faith in my writing and provided a great deal of continuity for me. And I somehow had to deal with his departure from the world. And I think that's when I sort of really realized one of the essential functions of poetry, which involves our kind of reconciling ourselves to the things in our experience that are irreconcilable. And certainly the death of our loved ones is one of those things. And it's something that can, never be healed, but so it reveals, in a sense, the limitations of poetry, but it also reveals the glory of poetry, that when you encounter this experience rendered by another poet, as we all have many, many times, it actually makes you feel less lonely in your own experience. And that's one of the kind of human things that poetry can do. I mean, I think there are other things poetry can do. Poetry can do transcendental things that are quite extraordinary, but this is an important human role for poetry. And we, all of us who are poets, probably at one time or another exercise this aspect of the art. And so this is my poem for Tom. Cliffhanging. The forces out to kill us with their benevolence are more crazed now than they were when you were alive. And more focused, too. Our ingratitude excites them. They're bubbling with remedies. Their providential impulses are a nimbus of knives. Their need to tell us they love us, with all their love in vain. You said before you died that this would happen. Thanks for the warning. You didn't let me know, though, that even our phantom selves would come after us, crawling out of the poems we made. They don't care about the transparent skin we wrapped them in, so they could watch their organs pulsing within. All they know is that we made their eyes too bright. They see more than they can stand, more than we ever could or would. They see the unending savagery that we could never really bear to see, and so we consigned our sight to them. They hate us for it. They've cut the phone lines and are chainsawing the front door. I'm a little worried about myself because all this hostility from every quarter bothers me much less than it should. Why the disconnect? I can't figure it out. And it's long past time to take precautions. The great wave that breaks through the crust of the world is rising and rising and lifting me far inland, only to suck me back and drop me dangling by one arm on the edge of the half-eaten cliff. I won't let myself fall, but I don't want to pull myself up. I'm ambivalent. I'm ambivalent forever now. But if you were here looking down on me and saying, grab my hand, I would, I know, I surely would. The next poem I'm going to read is in a different vein. And when I came to New York, this was in 1982, I immediately registered to vote. Once you register to vote, you become prey to the municipal authorities who might want you to serve on a jury. And I think about 6 months afterwards, I got my first summons to jury duty. And this was when I was living in Manhattan. And I went down, and I was a student then, and busy working to support myself and stuff. And I really didn't have time for jury duty. So I dreaded the idea of being called, and I wasn't called. And then a few years later, when I was still living in Manhattan, I got another summons, and I dodged the bullet again, and I was sort of happy. And then Suzanne and I moved to Brooklyn, and soon after that, this was in 1988 or 89, I got another summons, and I wasn't called again. And I started getting a little worried as to why I wasn't being impaneled, even though I was asked to come to the courthouse and spend a day waiting there. And I thought, well, you know, maybe it's because I'm a person of color. They don't want me on a jury. And this is a thought that goes through people's minds, right? And I'm not accusing the great city of New York of anything, but it was a thought that went through my mind. But I saw that other people of color were being impaneled. And then it happened 4 or 5 years later again. And then I thought, well, maybe it's because I'm South Asian or Indian, but it looked like people who looked like me were also being impaneled in that round. And so this had happened 5 times, and then I didn't get a call for a long, long time. And then I got, maybe in 2010, 2011, I was called to jury duty again. And again, I wasn't impaneled. I didn't even make it to the voir dire. And so I had to conclude that it was me. They just didn't want me. And so I went home and I wrote this poem. It's called Commas, Dashes, Ellipses, Full Stops, Question Marks. People restless on the pews downtown. People not of the book or of the book, itchy and introspective in the big cross-section of humanity room in the courthouse on Adams Street. Apothecaries, scriveners, gendarmes, recidivists. 60% are happy 65% of the time. 30% are okay 79% of the time. One is angry. That's what the bulletins from the ether say, and maybe we'll do something about it. But not today. Today is another day. Today is the day the self's whispering to itself in its 100 endangered languages merges with the sound of water running and scoring grooves in the damp, lithic, adhesive interiors, the limestone cavern of being where flying mammals hang and nurse their young and contemplate upside down the inscape person waiting to be called out of himself into the light of reason, to be impaneled on a jury here, right here in Brooklyn, so he can judge lest he not be judged, but forgiven, just forgiven. Grace, with no instinct to explain itself, pouring out of every portal. Are you blind that you can't see it? I am. I guess I am. Communion, submission, detachment. And what would I rather be doing than sitting here pretending not to look at the rest of you, of the city and of the world? So compelling is your exhausted, disillusioned, but steadfast commitment to the mechanisms of justice, the apparatus of democracy. 12 good persons and true will be summoned from the cardinal points to, but not me, I guess. The bailiff is saying, go home, not you, not today. For the 100th time I have been called but not chosen. For the 100th time I have to shuffle into the subway station at J Street, where a tall, sweet-looking, willowy violinist is playing the chaconne with apocalyptic focus and the ghost of a smile on her lips. Maybe she will say yes to me. Maybe I can stay with her always. Maybe I can sleep on my hands at her little desk. I'd rather go blind than to walk away from you, child. And the last poem I'm going to read is a dramatic monologue. And actually, I think I'll read, because Sally very kindly put me in touch with people who are doing something that I don't quite understand with poetry, you know, something very kind of new media, but thrilling and exciting. And Sally is involved with this cutting edge presentation and suggested me to this group, and they took one of my poems, and so I'll read that one. It's called The Estuary. The Estuary. The brown bear living near the estuary and wading out when the tide swells and the salmon run, during the days of the dwindling salmon runs, and slapping with his big right paw hook-nosed fish, whipsawing inland to spawn. The ambidextrous bear, furred like the forest from which he emerged, waddling into the unteachable waters to swat the salmon out the fast-running tide and catch the red salmon in his mouth and toss and juggle the sockeye salmon thrashing and drowning in the air. And when he's expressed himself completely, he catches with his jaw the self that swam 10,000 miles to the estuary, and daintily, mincingly, with one paw grasping the caudal fin and the other the head, eats that salmon as if he were we and the fish and ear of boiled corn. That bear is a bear about whom rich and complicated feelings can be felt. That is a bear from whom ideas about the state of nature can be derived. Cruelty is the wrong word to describe the pleasure he gets from playing with his lunch. Play and life are the same thing to him. Art and life, life and death. Creation impinging on a consciousness clear and crystalline. Pinpoint revelatory explosions unsoiled by words, unbesmirched. Creation clambering out of the waters, shaking itself off. Creation surrounding itself with itself. Stay down on the pavement where you just fell in a heap like a bag of laundry. Just stay there. Move even a little and you might damage something else. You've already done plenty of damage. Stay down, supine, stay down, and let the giant buildings loom over you. Let them in their abstract imperium stun you with their indifference. Wasn't that the reason you built them in the first place? Stay down, and ask yourself, could I be the bear in this fable? Could I be the fish? Could I be whoever is imagining all this? Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Good reading.
Wow. Thank you so much, Vijay. I'm going to introduce Rebecca Morgan Frank now. She's the author of 4 poetry collections, one of which, Little Murders Everywhere, was a finalist for the Kate Tufts Discovery Award. Her 4th book of poems, Oh You Robot Saints, was published by Carnegie Mellon in 2021. Her poems have appeared in the New Yorker, American Poetry Review, and Kenyon Review, to name just a few. Rebecca has a highly imaginative and other way of thinking. In a poem called Everybody's a Picasso, she writes, I've had my eye transferred to my chin so I can read the fine print. My foot moved next to my ear so I can hear myself walking home at night. In her latest collection, Oh You Robot Saints, Frank explores the line between the capabilities of humans and robots, a question we all who live in this world are asking now. I love this quote from a review in the Boston Globe. Frank picks at the tension between born and unborn, magic and science, fertility and sterility, the sexed and the sexless, the lifeless, the living and the never lived. That she reckons with the machine makes the aliveness of her voice, the heat behind it, all the more evident and all the more urgent. From an interview in the Kenyon Review, she says, I want my poems to be as useful as they are pleasing. Pleasing to me requires a certain sense of musicality. A poem needs to sound good. As for what makes a poem useful, perhaps the act of making offers much different uses than the act of reading. Creating a poem is about making something out of what we have and what we need. From a poem called The Mechanical Eves, listen to the music that she has here. How Edison's talking girls were rumored to be buried alive by the thousand. Dig one up and she will say the Lord's Prayer, a nursery rhyme. She won't speak her own mind. Oh, man has made her in his own image for beauty and service. Oh, man has made her a more pliable Eve with no desire of her own. Please welcome Morgan Frank.
So I'm reading from my new collection, Oh You Robot Saints, and this next poem is called Monk Automaton circa 1560, and this is a picture of this monk stripped down from his robes and his outer casing and x-rayed at the Smithsonian. Monk Automaton circa 1560. Looking at you now is like seeing a god or a king naked and starving in a field. Stripped of your damask robe and wooden limbs, you've been skinned to the iron spine that stems your clockworks to your cracked face. This is when you are most mortal. 2. You could hold him in both hands, a key term spiriting a clockwork miracle, each supplicant kneeling to his absence of breath, blessed by his cams and levers, the secrets beneath his robes, mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. His poplar jaw drops prayers, shuts in a wooden cross kiss as his right hand beats the absence of a heart. He wears the face of Saint Didacus, the tripod wheels of Hephaestus, son of the gods, father of the future. The monk almost floats. 3. Robots can do almost anything you please. They are up on sexual favors, cordless vacuuming, and martyring themselves by bomb. Less effective at deep tissue massage, excellent at listening to senior citizens, working on parking your car. What the future brings is nothing we haven't seen in this quest to be little gods and make what will do our bidding. The medieval monk who doled out benedictions arose from a ruler's dream and was then fathered by a clockmaker. The real monk now sits alone in the back room, smokes a cigar, enjoys a glass of whiskey. He's outsourced the job. The real monk is on the dole. The real monk is waiting in the parking lot for offers of day labor. The real monk is unloading boxes at Costco. The real monk sits in the factory, building himself by hand. There's this wonderful stories of this medieval estate in France called Hesdin, the medieval pronunciation, and there were some of the avian automatons, the bird automata were mixed in with real birds, so that as you were moving through, you might be confused or marvel at their togetherness. Mechanical birds. Everywhere around us, Pygmalions clutch their golden wives, while above, furious birds turn away from false mates again and again. Though the wind through bronze birds makes the sweetest song, one no breathing creature could make. Self-operating machines. Everything is a clock inside, geared and oiled to sing and turn, the body even, no different than that of medieval mechanical monkeys lining the bridge in the park at Hesdin, repelted with badger fur every year. For the surface of life runs by a mere series of cause and effects buried beneath with care and craft. In grief, the gears and springs spin on, the water pumps through the pipes, and the body moves. We were all once part of a set of nesting dolls, a robot designed in the body of another robot. And as always, the shell falls away, rust, decays, an engineered failure. Early automata were considered miracles, but of course had no sense of their makers. They never saw their mother's body graying on display or felt themselves unmade by absence, as if a spring let loose a monkey's howl, so real it sounds like lament. Mechanical tortoise with Triton rider, 17th century. There's an exhausting mechanical plotting. A brass man with a trident rides the tortoise, his body adhered to the gold-gilded shell. Even his face has hardened. Why can't we pick up the pace? What if we were to stand up and run? This is a man of the sea. See his tail in place of legs? But look inside, you'll see emptiness. Why not just catch a tortoise and watch it move? The stories of medieval and really just thousands of years of early automata are just fascinating. And when I read this legend about Descartes supposedly making an automaton replica of his daughter, I knew this poem would be in the making. Descartes' daughter. You can recreate such tiny dimensions, even make the body move, mold hollow ears to speak to, comb her hair, locks made out of the real thing. Encased in a wooden box, she sailed to Sweden with him, her automaton girl body built by his grieving hands. His own Francine had died at only 5. This wasn't at odds with his treatise on man. Bodies or machines made no differently than a medieval fountain's automaton moving through cause and effect, like how the sea captain, terrified, threw her soulless body overboard. Meanwhile, Descartes' own death remains contested. You might ask what sort of maker sets up so many possibilities for destruction, but consider the clockmaker's job to design for rust and wear. You'll have to go elsewhere for philosophies of bodies in motion, the collision of two machines, and what to do if one has a soul or a mind. Those who took possession of Descartes' skull graffitied the surface with their signatures as if to lay claim on all it once housed. It's not hard to imagine him alive, cradling the automaton in his cabin, begging his God to give back the soul to the machine he had made. Invention number 3. A ground holds history, the bones of every creature that came before, the bones of petulance, of rage, of incredulity, the bones of tomorrow, of maybe, of you never. If you put them together like the small rodent bones found in an owl pellet, you can recreate what was consumed. A skeleton materializes in tiny parts, but the truth is the small mouse is dead, no matter how you order its remains. It's nice. I've been picturing all day that I'm actually in the Hudson Valley. That's where I went to college. So I'm picturing springtime there. And for those of you who are there, look out your window for me. Spring's not quite here in Chicago this time. I hold with those who favor fire. 19th century body snatchers dug down to the head and roped the body up, chucked jewels back to dirt, little interest in mementos, only the corpses themselves. That's how we learned our bodies had a life on their own, a worth without us. Now we can freeze and sell our eggs, our sperm, our embryos, our future selves unyielding. Now they can freeze your death to keep you alive, slow down time in the body. It doesn't matter if you're stripping the dead or excavating the living. The fountain of youth is ice. So I was writing poems about automata, and then I read an article about robo-bees, and I was telling my friend about it, and this was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she said, my neighbor is the roboticist who's making the robo-bees. Let me get you over there for dinner. So one conversation with the roboticist, and I was fascinated, and robots fill this book. And that robo-bees poem is too long to read here, but I'm going to read you this other poem, which pretty much everything in this, as far as I know, exists in the world in some form, just to, you know, maybe frighten you just a little about the robot future. Not everybody else's bestiary yet. Then came the soft animals, the snake and octopus slinking along. You've seen the octopus's escape artist sneaking out of cracks and holes, hiding in a teapot, plotting the big adventure. Now she moves through chemical reaction, the first soft robot taking to the sea, while the real thing once disassembled her own aquarium, waiting in a puddle to be found. Now imagine her robot double dismantling at will that which we tried to contain, swimming off into the deep, re-emerging like the snake that slithers into your garden in trapezoidal kirigami skin. Its cuts keep it crawling through bursts of air. An innocuous slinky in colorful garb, this robot can sidewind anywhere. Now ask why everyone, everything now harbors a weapon in your mind. Do you dread the snake under your own bed? Is it the real tooth and venom you fear, or this programmed body double here? We're told of a fault built on flesh, the flesh of a fruit, the flesh of a woman. Now this man-made flesh, a reptilian test of applied knowledge, industrial sin. Enter the latest sensation. A cockroach robot sliding through the cracks to get to you, away from you. Extinction has been eradicated, bought. Replacements are on order. Enter Robotanica, the world of the wild robot. Woodpecker, dragonfly, kangaroo, child, unborn, they can do the job. 2 by 2, battery powered to keep the world moving, replacing their organic prototypes, centipedes, spiders, termites, and bees. These are just the beginnings of an evolving robo-nation, as if someone had decided to revise, start over, this time using human labor and invention. Loving the dead is what we are here for. We will bury all of them, our leaders, our bards and buskers, our friends, our unmet ancestors, our parents. Love has nothing to do with this. Above the windowsill, a line of red ants makes its way somewhere, towards the leftover cheese plate, across the folds of your trousers, into your ear. They are driven by the scent of death. My mother taught me this, to remove the tiny corpse from the house. The dead are a roadmap. They leave behind the lure of their histories, your thoughtless violence. Still, we try to shake the sensation, the sense of something moving over us. I've got 2 more poems to read here. This one is the first section of a longer poem called The Girlfriend Elegies. I did not find the body. It was wintertime where I was. Women gathered in bars, their bodies like bare trees, naked arms giving fruit to hands in gestures. Ice was everywhere. I could still feel the command of your hands around a woman's waist when two-stepping. It was the only time you wore joy. Your anger muscular in your small, tired body that always hurt. I had seen your childhood once. There was a hole in the wall of the living room. It led somewhere. Outside, the land was dry, grassless. We had come to rescue the dog, whom we found wrestling her chain in the dirt. There was a lake somewhere nearby, but no sign of it except boats behind cars. Later, I learned your father was a sculptor, your mother what we now call a porter. The road home was long, more dryness. Even the dog was wrapped in silence. We slept in the back of the truck, our heads at the opening, watching stars fall. The future then a mirage, a place I'd save you. I bought you things on my credit card. We drank in the bars where everyone knew you and the southwest summer burned through. And then there were months in which I tried to escape your drowning like a clasp around my throat. I fled in the night. Years passed. In the dry climates, there is less of an odor. There was no sign of the dog when they found you dead in your chair. It had been days. I thought of the woman in Croatia dead for decades in her apartment. No one to find her, find you. There was a word for you back then, mischievous in that one picture, when we went to the mountains, your body awakening from the mysterious illness, alert fawn, a boy body freed momentarily from a terrible girlhood, which is not to say you would have wanted to be a man, which is not to say I could have saved you. I'm going to finish with the last poem in the book, and it's Poetry Month every month for most of us here, I'm sure, but I'm also grateful that everyone's here when there's so many competing events for the official Poetry Month. This is called Restorations. A man took a hammer to Michelangelo's Pietà, breaking Mary's nose in three, fragmenting her fingers, leaving shards at tourists' feet. Someone rescued her eyelids while someone else stole a tiny chip of her, then later sent it back. Outside San Leandro's church, Saint Felicitas stood stoic as 8 bullets pierced her plastered body. The vandal's aim marked in its numbered fury at sacrifice. In a Nagasaki cathedral, bombed Mary's eyes turned to crystal, the only survivor. She watched everything destroyed around her. Full restoration is impossible when dealing with the flesh, but we had always hoped our art would be immortal. In grief, we feel the wounds become stone.
Thank you so much, Morgan. That was incredible. So it's now my privilege to introduce our last reader, Indran Amirthanayagam. He's a poet, essayist, and translator, and was born in Colombo, Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. He was raised in Sri Lanka, London, and Honolulu. Indran has authored numerous poetry collections, including The Elephants of Reckoning, 1993, Ceylon, R.I.P., 2001, The Splintered Face, 2008, On Civil War, 2013, and Coconuts on Mars, 2019. Listen to all his abilities here. It's amazing to me. He writes, translates, and publishes poetry and essays in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Haitian Creole. In a review of The Splintered Face, Jennifer Garfield described how Indran's poems achieve a devastating intimacy that necessarily dissolves the separation between countries and people. What more in this world that we're living in can we ask of poems now to break down those divides? It's what we need. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Kenyon Review, the New England Review, among so many others. He's a US diplomat, has lived in several countries, including Haiti, Belgium, Argentina, and the Republic of Cote d'Ivoire. Indran is one of those poets about whom I have heard so much over the years, but have not had the privilege to hear read. So I'm particularly excited to hear him read tonight. As you might have gathered, Indran's poems have an incredibly wide scope. They ask us about our responsibility in the world to other humans. I love this quote from a poem called Face for its questions. I'll read you a little bit of it. Imagine half your face rubbed out, yet you are suited up and walking to the office. How will your mates greet you? With heavy hearts, flowers, rosary beads? How shall we greet the orphan boy, the husband whose hand slipped, children and wife swept away? Indran is a poetry citizen of the world, and I learned from reading an interview with Indran conducted by Nedra Rodrigo that Indran comes from a long line of poets, which I just thought was interesting. My father encouraged my poetry, being a poet himself and a fine literary critic. Although poetry is certainly not the profession of choice among Tamil families, my choice could not be denied given my father's choice and also that of my uncle on my mother's side, the poet Miri James Thureraja Timabutu, who founded Poetry London. What an incredible poetry heritage. Please welcome Indran Amirthanayagam.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sally and Jennifer and Margot and Hudson Valley. Thank you for this generous words of introduction. I'm going to go on a little trip as I've been traveling all my life with this reading. So I'm going to begin with a poem from my first book, which The Elephants of Reckoning, and then go from there. Poem I haven't read in many years, but I would like to read it tonight. It's called For M. I remember the Saturday night invitation to break bread, uncork a good French red and dance, the trembling tongues of our second attempt to sing, to bathe again in our blood, to wet my patched ancient beard in the ripe grapes of your scarf. I remember the dream of meeting at 9 p.m. What more natural thing than to come by train from the country, get on the subway, and arrive smiling at your door, to take off my shoes and hold your hands and stroke your neck, your apricot ears, your hair of the wheat field, your eyes of the Trincomalee Sea, all the stars shining, mirroring the night sky on your face. What more natural thing than to love you beyond the dissolving of the moon, the sweeping up of the stars, the ash, the blotting out of the sun. I mentioned the journey. Here's one about what you lose on the journey and what perhaps inspires you to gain other, in my case, other languages. I lost one, Tamil. I lost two actually, Sinhalese as well, and gained several others. You must love. You must love the land when you leave to build your house on the sea. Love what's lost, the mango tree burning in the garden, the curious noose of the familiar coat of arms. Love the ball turning strong, spinning in a dark, faraway land. Love the tongue you'll never again speak, that wrapped you and bled you and dried up, some every day on the other side of the sea. I've been an islander most of my life in many different islands, including England and Ceylon and the Hawaiian Islands and Manhattan. You quoted from the poem Face, which is the title poem of the book, The Splintered Face, Tsunami Poems, a book I wrote after the tsunami of 2004, Boxing Day, December 26, 2004. And certainly some of my books have been inspired by cataclysms, like that cataclysm, which was a kind of a natural cataclysm, I suppose, set off by an earthquake, that wave that killed so many people, not only in Sri Lanka, but in many countries in Asia. But, and the political cataclysm of the war, of the civil war in the Sri Lankan style, which I call Uncivil War in a book. And that book remains in print, and I'll read from that now, Uncivil War. I'll read two poems from there. This one's called Fire Department. Where is your village burning Where is your village? Mind feels. Where is your village? Blasted in crossfire, wounded under jungle trees. Where is your village? Running across marshes, shot in the back. Where is your village? Waving white flags, frisked, registered, supervised in a camp. Where is your village? Blowing up army friskers, other villages. Where is your village? Toronto, Berlin, Tamil Nadu. Where is your village? Madagascar as option has not been discussed. Where is your village? Hasta la vista, special envoy. Where is your village? Burning. The war ended in 2009. I suppose it depends how you count it. You could count it and say it began in 1983 with Black July, or you could count back to 1958 when my father's life was saved by his colleagues, his Sinhalese colleagues working in the what's called the Kachari, the government offices in the city of Gaul. This little poem is a sort of autobiographical poem. It imagines what would have happened if he had not been saved. Riot. When the mob assembled in the plaza outside the law courts at the Gaul Fort, 1958, friends spirited the assistant government agent, my future father, out of his hands. Without friends, he would not have lived. Married, I would not be here to remember this. So there's a very basic biological need to be born in order to write poems. So thank you, father and mother, for that. I'll finish read the section from Uncivil War with another poem about migration, which is very much on my mind and on our minds these days. It's called Ready to Move. We are Mayans, we are Tamils, we are Armenians, we are Germans who lived once in Poland. We are Burkinabes stuck in Abidjan, Somalians in Maine and Massachusetts. We are witnesses to the only truth worth repeating. Have a bag of essentials, holy book, toothbrush, a fresh set of clothes ready to put on your back when historical conditions change suddenly. Yeah, well, I think we can also change the historical conditions ourselves. We did that in this country with the election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And so there are some positives that have come out of the pandemic. I'll read one poem from Printed Face. I think the hardcover is still available, but Hanging Loose is a wonderful press, and they keep their books in print. So I'm sure this will come back out soon in paperback. I remember Robert Hirschhorn tonight, who passed away recently, one of the co-founders of Hanging Loose Press. And so think of him as well as I read. Words and Orchids. We had gone for a sea bath and had just sat down to eat mangoes and pittu, a spicy pol sambol. My husband was thrilled with home food and sea air, the orchids the waiter arranged elaborately on our table. I wanted the flowers moved because they blocked my view of the sea, but my husband insisted. He said the waiter had taken such trouble, and in the States, how often would we eat mangoes by an ocean framed with orchids? Those were his last words. When the first wave roared over us, I held on to a palm tree. Then as the water receded, ran and ran uphill. Met our friends there, but my husband stayed behind. I do not have his body, just these words about flowers, his grin as he sucked mangoes with his hands. Now I'll read from one poem from Coconuts on Mars, which is a very personal book. I mean, there's a lot of very family poems, and I wanted to read. Oh, I've lost my place. I'll let me see if I can find it quickly. Here it is. It's called Domestic and Foreign Affairs. So it's sort of looking at the two parts of my life together. The domestic and then the foreign. Domestic and foreign affairs. My mother wishes to travel to Honolulu, to Lourdes and London, to Colombo. She wants to make the trip back. At 79, her mind has begun to fly, and we, her passengers, are to cancel the obligations of our current lives, gather funds, hire the most plaintive singer, throw a party finer, more complex than any other, to be remembered in poetry, or we can retire or take extended leave to care for a family member. The means are in our hands, dear brother, fellow diplomat, as you prepare to serve your country again abroad. Do not forget the domestic issue, the mother. And I'll finish with reading from my latest book in English, The Migrant States. And I'm going to finish actually with, before I read a poem from Migrant States to finish, let me try a very new poem out on you. I just wrote it today. I've been writing recently again in Portuguese, and my friend Marcos Ayrton de Freitas is here on the Zoom from Brasilia, so I'll dedicate this poem to him. It's called Correndo. The Portuguese needs a little work, but I'll read it in Portuguese and then in English. Correndo. É quente, e o corpo e o espírito sentem que chega o verão, mas a mulher desaparece, mesmo antes da pandemia. Estou com fome, estou morrendo de sede. Preciso que você conheça minhas doenças. Para que existe poema, se não para compartilhar tudo? Porém, se é possível que você está cansado de minhas reclamações, que eu devo cambiar a rua, ir a outro país, como antes, a solução do migrante, que corre na sangue, corre. Running. It is hot, and body and mind feel that summer is coming. But the woman disappeared even before the pandemic. I'm hungry. I am thirsty. I need you to know my troubles. Why does a poem exist if not to share everything? But it is possible that you are tired of my complaints, that I must change my path, go to another country, the solution of the migrant that runs in the blood, runs. And I'll finish, I'm not sure how much time I have, but I'll finish with maybe two poems from migrant states. The first one is called Morning Mass, Halloween for Lola. Hushed tones, place of worship, early morning. A woman kneeling in the pew could not get up. The priest brought her communion. Then another parishioner called for an ambulance. The fireman, a friend of the ambulance driver, arrived in his fire truck. They work together naturally. What to do now? Walk to the front, dip fingers in holy water, then go out to my car. Paramedics will lay her on a stretcher, pump her heart, wheel her away to the hospital. Life is coming to its end. A repeat. In my dad's case, his heart stopped while he kneeled at a pew. Nobody could revive it. He would have loved to see my daughter smiling as she guards the witch's cauldron this Halloween, sweets in hand. And throughout the migrant states, there are a series of poems in dialogue with Walt Whitman, written on the occasion of his 200th birthday. and which is past now. It must have been in 2019 that he turned 200. And anyway, I wrote these. I think about Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who also turned 100 in 2019 and passed away recently, another great poet. So one of the occasions was a panel on Pan. And so this poem is called The Emotion Again. I asked the panel, the audience, what next? We have finished celebrating Walt Whitman's 200th birthday. Who will lead us into the next century? Do we find the driver in our own batteries, energy coursing through cells from foods we eat for body and mind? Like this delicious feast finished now, 10 days at summer's beginning to honor the founder of our Republic of Letters. Not the first, but the most expansive American, who stretched his imagination to encompass the continent and traveled beyond to India, to the moon, sun, and stars, into the interior constellations in a leaf of grass. Walt Whitman, we do not want the party to end. We wish to keep stroking your gray beard, reading the day's news out loud as you lay dying in Camden, bedridden, reported on almost daily by the Times. If you had drunk milk punch, broth, and twice when you seemed to have kicked the bronchial pneumonia, eaten a mutton chop. You dropped out of the news too when the paper thought you had improved enough to live without their noting every food and visitor, brother George, sister-in-law, biographer, favorite niece, Jessie, and your final physician, Dr. McAllister. Your last words, a request to attended Fritzinger, worry, shift, roll over, Walt Whitman. You told the doctor, who asked if you were in pain, no, almost inaudibly, a wisp of smoke floating out of the row house into the street, mixing with the air, falling later on as rain in poems and songs, recollected in tranquility again and again. Thank you very, very much. Love to all. Thank you.
Wonderful readings. Jennifer, are we going to have a Q&A now? And you're kind of in charge of that end, right? Can't hear you.
We are going to have a Q&A now. Thank you so much to all of the poets for this incredible reading. Thank you, Sally, for making this happen. Thank you to Slappering Hall Press and all of the editors, Mervyn, Margot, Peggy. All of you are here in the audience. Thank you to the advisory committee. It's our pleasure to have this as one of our 6 Slappering Hall Press readings for the year. It was really wonderful to hear the 3 of you together. What a great pairing. Thank you, Sally, for your wonderful introductions. We are going to have a brief Q&A. And I just want to remind you that we do have another important poetry event this Saturday. It's with the Westchester Poetry Festival with the Master School. And Reginald Dwayne Betts is our keynote. And Margot Taft-Stever, Sean Singer, Leela Chatti, Tyree Day, Aaron Coleman will all be reading. So please, it's free and open to the public on Zoom, up to 500 people. So we hope to have you back for that. And Sigrid Nunez and Russell Banks will be reading on the 14th of April. So we do have several questions in the chat. And one of them was for Indran about translation, and also how does he decide what language to write in and if he translates his own work, because Sally mentioned many languages.
Yes, I have translated my own work. I've done more of it recently than in the past. There was a time when I didn't translate it at all, but recently I've I've got into sort of a habit of translating occasionally, like the poem I just read, which I translated from Portuguese into English. How do I choose which language? I set myself little challenges like this. Right now, I have two assignments every week, one to write a poem for a Haitian newspaper and the other to write a poem for a Dominican newspaper. So for each one I write in French or Creole and the other in Spanish. So I know that every week I will need to write a poem in that language, at least one poem, and hopefully a good one, and correct it and send it off to those papers. And then the other challenge is like, for example, with Portuguese. Now I'm setting up a reading on the 17th of April, actually, inviting you all, called Revolução dos Cravos. It's the Red Carnation Revolution, which happened in Portugal on April 25th, 1974, when Portugal overthrew its dictator, and then the colonies in Angola and Mozambique and so on shortly afterwards became free or liberated and independent. And so the reading came up sort of to honor and mark, not exactly on the same day, but and live independence and human rights and peacemaking, and bringing poets together, sharing their work, not only in Portuguese, but in Spanish and English. So it's an occasion. So there's a reading. And then I started thinking, well, I'm starting to communicate with poets in Portuguese. And so the language, and I started to listen to the radio from Brazil every day. And so the language started to come back that I used to speak more fluently in the past. And then I started to write in Portuguese again. So it really depends, but I do dream sometimes in English and sometimes in French, sometimes Spanish. So I think they're living languages for me. I was a little afraid that my Portuguese had become a dormant language, but thankfully that's not the case. And but I have a big question mark in my head, which is to do with Tamil. Which is, I would think, one of my native languages along with English. And I'm just thrown against the wall trying to understand how or when, or if I ever will try hard and get it back or move it ahead. But I think I've seen recently a few poems of mine translated into Tamil by a Tamil poet. And anyway, it's just sort of a bizarre sensation seeing the words and not being able to understand them. Anyway, thank that. So yeah, I one very quickly, I try to answer the question. I might be tired in one language, but refreshed in the other. So that's how I play this game between the languages. So I might be tired or exhausted, and then but I'm like a newborn in the other, and I can go and start to cry. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a great answer. We have a question for Vijay. Would you say your entry into a poem is an image, a line, an idea, or something else? And does it vary from poem to poem?
You're muted, Vijay.
I've vexed this question in my head for a long time, because I always feel if I know, then I can duplicate the energy, but I've never really been able to figure it out. I know it has something to do with a unit in language, a phrase that has a certain resonance. And that phrase might be determined by the image, but oftentimes it isn't determined by an image. It's just it's a rhythmic entity that seems to generate something in and out of its own, its own peculiar aliveness. And I think the beginning of the poem is actually the place where you are in a mysterious communion with, forces that we would call divine in some way, and it's mostly the beginning, but sometimes it's just a moment right? And you might think of it as the beginning, but it doesn't really wind up in the beginning of the finished poem. And so, yeah, and it's probably with that question, the issue is, do you want to examine it too closely, or do you maybe want to kind of, pass by it quietly, because it does have an aspect of the sacred to it. If that makes sense. I don't know.
It does. Thank you for that. And maybe Morgan, you would, and Indran, maybe you would each like to answer that question as well, since it is a really interesting question, if you have anything to add.
Can you go ahead, Morgan, please?
Oh, the sort of where a poem begins.
For you.
Yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated with that as a process of where Mary Ruefle talks about this in Madness, Rack, and Honey. This idea of this mysterious place where a poem begins, right? Like where did it begin, in our brain, or out in the world, or like it's some worm that but that's my image, not hers, that comes in. For me, I'm very much led by ear, right? So I think it's the rhythm of a phrase, or a line that begins to play in my head, but also it's about conversation. I mean, for my work always comes out of reading or listening to other people's work and engagement with the world, and that something can be a spark. So, for me, my favorite poets are ones where, as a reader, where I really have a sense of a mind at work, right? So a poem for me begins in that mysterious grappling with some larger question also, that might be sparked by how someone else has represented the world, and then makes its way into language. So those are still the two portals that bring me there. How about you, Indra?
Yeah, I love all those things you said. For me, where a poem begins, I mean, it's a sort of a question I'm sort of asking myself, I'm speaking to myself in a way, trying to figure out why I am who I am, why I arrived at this particular point in my life, in this planet, and myself, but I think I trick myself into thinking that I'm speaking this every man, every person character, where we have come. I'm fascinated by the we, where we've come as a society, where we've come as a species, and so I'm trying to think that the poem can help in that dialogue we have among ourselves, around the campfires we build ourselves. So it's a kind of resolution of a dilemma that I seek to resolve through the writing down in lines and images of that interior conversation. But I think at the same time, it's a conversation that's musical in a way. I mean, it's in touch with the music of in speech, in a bird song, and in the world, the wind rustling. I try to capture that. For me, as Irvin once reminded me of Derek's Walcott's statement, "Donde está la música?" So for me, where is the music is fundamental to my writing and conceiving of the poem. Yeah.
Thank you. Sally put a question in the chat, which was that she wanted each of you to talk a little bit about what you were drawn to during the pandemic. If you were writing, if you were reading.
Yeah, it was more in terms of the poets that gave you something that you needed during the pandemic, was what I was really thinking.
Well, even what poets gave us during the pandemic. the readings we gave.
What poets you were drawn to that you felt gave you something essential and that you needed during the pandemic, whether they were contemporary poets or ancient poets? I'm just curious.
Well, in my case, it was just the window, the poet speaking through the window, that all these windows that we are sitting at now. I mean, the pandemic gave me this chance to listen to you wherever you are in the world, reciting your poems. I mean, I became part of a group called Poetas Sin Fronteras, Poets Without Borders, where we would read poems to each other every day, almost every day at a certain time of the day. And we'd connect and so listen to each other, our new poems, old poems, poems by other poets. It was such a communal sharing across the internet, across the countries, and so the pandemic took away, but it also gave, and one of the things it gave was the poetry through the window for me.
What about for you, Morgan? What were you doing during the pandemic?
I mean, reading not just poetry, of course, but it was interesting having less access to libraries, right? And spending time in one's own library, revisiting books and kind of moving your way through those. But I also found myself drawn to some poets that I don't normally have an affinity to. So suddenly I was wanted to read a lot of George Often. I mean, and that hadn't been someone that I had been drawn to before. So I think I was wanting to be sort of maybe pushed out of some of the more lyrical, compressed, rhetorically tight poems that I often return to in need, and wanting to move into things that reflected the strangeness of being in the world. But such a wide range. We have so much access, and as of that idea of the window, right? That we're also have been listening, right? And I would say not just reading, but listening and getting to come to virtual events and hear human voices reading poems to us through these times.
Yeah, and that's a great answer. I'm wondering if you have any advice for emerging poets who are putting together their first collections right now, because we have several poets, students at the center in the audience right now who are doing that very important, very mysterious work of putting a first collection together. So any advice you might have for them?
I always have lots of advice for that in terms of, teaching graduate students and having fun exercises that we try to explore. And one that I love is have it in paper and spread it out all over the wall and move it around and live with it as a physical being. But an exercise that has worked really well with my graduate students is reading, if you have a structure, reading the first line of all the poems. It's almost like a cento poem of your first lines, and reading through and noticing what happens when you follow that.
Did you freeze?
Lines.
Whoops. I think that she froze and dropped off because of her internet connection. So she'll probably come back in. But Indran, did you have anything you'd like to discuss about that, putting together a collection? I know you have to think back a while because you have so many collections.
Well, I remember I was accumulating poems and reading them and learning, reading them on the stages and different stages in New York City at the time. And then I ended up putting together a huge manuscript of maybe 250 pages or something. And Hanging Loose, Bob Dershon asked me to send him send them a manuscript, which was, and then I sent them all these poems, and then Dick Lurie, a wonderful poet who works with Penguin Blues, edited these poems, and then there was this back and forth, and it was a bloodthirsty affair. My favorite poem at the time, So Beautiful, which everybody's favorite poem of mine, never made it into the book. It was a quite difficult experience of having to tussle. He just didn't think it fit the theme of the book, which was the poet looking back, at the island, far away, that was burning, and, the war and the nostalgia for it. And So Beautiful about lovers on a New York City subway just didn't quite work. But those are the kinds of decisions that I thought swore I would never publish another book with Hanging Loose, and then I did, of course, 10 years later, and I'm very proud of that relationship with that editor, which has continued through 3 books. So you live and you learn, and you have to give up as well in that process of learning. But look, there used to be a time when poets would publish books that were called 12 poems or 18 poems. And that was not that long ago. Dylan Thomas did that, and it was perfectly fine to publish a book called Poems. I think we are too caught up in this need to make it new in a kind of superficial sense, like the making it new is in the title, is in the organization. So I know this may not be helpful because editors may want that in terms of sales of the book and presenting the book but I would try not to worry too much about how all of them hang together, but that if they hang together as poems that move you, that you consider essential, then use that as the main criterion, and when you get to about 60 or 80 pages, then stop and send it on to the editor. And I know you have to try and get poems published in magazines, and you can also send poems to the Poetry Channel I run on YouTube, and I'd be happy to post you reciting them. So the point is that we've democratized the space, and anybody can set up a YouTube channel and present poems. But I think that's a good thing. I think we have alternatives and alternatives publishing and self-publishing, and many small presses and many good ones. So I think the opportunities are there, but try not to be too anxious about your first book, because remember, this is just one. You might end up writing many more. So think about the second book as well at the same time as you're finishing up the first. If that's helpful, that's my thought to share. Yeah.
That is very helpful. And I wish that there were more editors like you who did feel that you could still have a book of poetry that just hung together by the fact that they're all written in the same voice of the particular poet. But that does really help. And I think probably the more established a poet gets, the easier it is to publish a book like that without a theme specifically. But these were really interesting answers. I think we have time for one more question. And it's a follow-up question to Robin's question to Indran about translation. And when you translate your own poetry, how do you decide to do it? Is it a word for word comparison translation, or is it more the way you would maybe translate someone else's work? It's not as literal.
In my case, it tends to veer towards the literal. There's the meaning of the word in the original language being captured in the English, in the translated language. That's just my way of approaching it. I tend to be fairly conservative, I suppose, in that sense as a translator, and perhaps I'm not. I need to shake myself up and take more risks, but always I think about the music. It's not just a photographic a reproduction, but it has to have life and movement, and so if there's a need to change even the paragraph structure, the verse structure, the original might be three-lined verses and stanzas, and then the English might be 4 or 2, whatever. I'm willing to play with that. Finally, it has to be a poem that speaks to the reader into the ear, plays in the ear of the reader in English. The original language is almost it's less important somehow, you know. Now, obviously, there's the bilingual reader who can appreciate both languages and so on. But I would, I, at the very least, capture the meaning of the word, you know, in the translated language, and then if you can add the music, all the better, you know. And if you can, or find a corresponding music, yes, you should work hard to do that, and that can take time, and it's a very individual decision. Finally, you know, how much exhaustion and labor you're willing to put in. Alistair Reid used to say, he told me that he would limber up every morning translating 5 or 6 poems, and then he would go on with his writing day. That might be so it's almost like a morning walk. The translating is a kind of exercise that you have to do in a discipline, and that might be helpful if you're looking at translations. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Indran. Morgan, did you have anything that you were finishing up with your advice when you got cut off and frozen?
I just shared an essay in the chat that some people might find useful by Natasha Sage, if you're looking for some inspiration for shaping your book. And, you know, I have a lot of practical tools, but I think I have one practical thing that I would say in terms of, as someone who's, you know, screen and judge contest, is less is more, you know, for a first book. Like, don't be shy about cutting poems. And the other is that there's so many different incarnations, so many different shapes, so many versions of the book there could be, and there's no right one, right? And the shape that you might come upon that speaks to you 1 week, you probably already experienced this, 3 weeks later doesn't make sense to you. So I think just sort of trusting that it will be, I don't know, it's almost like a photograph from a moment in your life as poet, right? It's a screenshot that day when you shaped that book that might have changed at another time. And I hope that might take some of the pressure off, that there's some one perfect way the manuscript's supposed to click into place. And good luck.
Yes, that really is helpful. Thank you so much. Well, thank you all for being here. And of course, again, thank you to Sally for those wonderful introductions. And I just want to say again, you are all the best audience for readings. You're just such an attentive crew, and you always have wonderful questions. Thank you to Lynn McGee for putting all of the writers' books, the links for their books in the chat. And you will get information from us. Thank you tomorrow from Sophia. And don't forget that this video will be up in a day or two on our YouTube channel. So if you missed anything, or if you didn't have a good connection, you can hear it again. And thank you all for being here. It was really wonderful to hear your work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I second that.